Well, today on the show, we get to have one of my favorite authors on. We've been talking in the last several weeks about two different things, and they actually do merge together in many ways. We've been talking about masculinity and how men have really struggled and suffered in a current culture. But what does that mean and why? There's are big questions we need to answer. But then we've also talked about, and this is, especially for Ex Nihilo, this is a huge part of everything we do. We've talked a lot about the person body divide that our next guest really talks about, and this idea that Gnosticism has crept in, and we've separated the body from the person, and so whatever happens to the body, it's like whatever, as long as the person's unaffected. And so my next guest, I'm super privileged to have her on, Nancy Pearcey. She's a professor. She's a scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. We just had an awesome conversation about her experience there offline. She's also the author of two of the books I talk about from the pulpit often, outside of the Bible, of course, Love Thy Body and the Toxic War on Masculinity, both of which we're going to talk about today. Two books I reference all the time. She's also been quoted in the New York Times, or the New Yorker rather, Newsweek, all these different things. But one of the quotes is really awesome. She has been named one of the top 5 women apologists by Christianity Today and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Nancy, what's it like to be that important? That's amazing.
Yeah, I love that quote from The Economist. For people who don't know The Economist, it is considered one of the most influential secular conservative, economically conservative publications out there. So I have to tell you, that was wonderful when they labeled me as a top female intellectual. So I'm glad you brought it up, and it's even better than Christianity Today that said top Christian apologist,
Yes.
because it's in the secular world, and that was amazing that they would print an article that used that used that label, and who acknowledged that Christians actually do have some intellectual leaders, even if they're women.
That's right. I mean, I love that. I love that you brought that up. And it's true. And, here you are, a prominent female in the space of apologetics, and you teach, you're an author, you're a speaker, but yeah, you wrote a book on masculinity. And so I just want to start right off the top and ask you a rather serious question around it. People accuse Christian men, especially being these oppressive patriarchs, male-dominated patriarchy. You can't tell me anything because you're a man. People, they want their wives to stay at home, keep them in the kitchen sort of thing, 1950s style nuclear family. And can be even prone to psychological abuse. And while, I guess the secular world might say, maybe it's a wax nose, but the secular world might say, well, women outside of Christianity, they have freedom. They get to work if they want, do what they want. But you make the interesting claim in the book that they sort of test out Christian men, that is, of having some of the lowest levels of abuse and divorce. So I'd love you to start there. How is that happening? What's the disconnect?
Yeah, so I do teach apologetics, and so my book is primarily an apologetics book on why the secular world gets masculinity so wrong. Why does the secular world think masculinity is toxic? And so I do start with examples of that. Like I have to tell you, one of the quotes that made me decide to write the book was in the Washington Post, an article actually titled, "Why Can't We Hate Men?" I thought, really? In a mainstream publication? And there was a Huffington Post editor who tweeted, #KillAllMen. And then, of course, said it was a joke. Speaking of jokes, you can buy t-shirts that say, "So many men, so little ammunition." And books have appeared with titles that are very blunt, very blatant, like "I Hate Men" and "No Good Men," and "Are Men Necessary?" What I found really tragic, though, is that even men have sometimes jumped on that bandwagon. There was a fairly well-known book author who wrote, "Talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer."
My gosh.
And then this one is actually not in the book because it came out afterward, but in the news, you may have seen this. The producer, the director of the movie Avatar was in the news saying testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system.
Wow.
And there was even a tabloid in Australia that showed a photograph of a 6-year-old boy and that said, how can we stop this potential monster from becoming, toxic masculinity? A 6-year-old boy. So no wonder boys are being taught to hate themselves. I quote a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, and she said, "In my practice, I am now seeing especially young men coming in who feel demoralized and depressed because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity." And so this is the direction I was going with my research. And then I sort of stumbled on the answer, right? In a book, you don't want to just show the question, the problem, you want to show the answer. And I sort of stumbled on the sociological studies done of Christian men. And this is what you were talking about in your question. It turns out, I mean, I'm as surprised as anyone else when I discovered this, that precisely because Christian men have been targeted, they've been studied, right? They might not have been, but because the secular narrative was that Christian men are exhibit A of toxic masculinity, they were studied. Let me give you just one example. I found plenty of examples, but I'll just give you one quote. This was the co-founder of the Church to movement, which followed the Me Too movement. Mm-hmm. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. Wow. And then I looked at the sociological studies, and they found exactly the opposite. They did find that evangelical Christian men, test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. Let me break that down. They are the most loving to their wives. And of course, the first question I get is, yeah, well, their wives, of course they said that because their husband's sitting right there. And actually, no, I should explain that most of the I quote about a dozen surveys. Most of the surveys draw on large public databases, like the University of Chicago has what's called the General Social Survey that they do every 2 years. And so they're interviewing men and women separately. And so, yes, evangelical women do test out as saying they're the happiest with the way their husbands treat them, with their husbands' love and affection. Evangelical fathers are more engaged with their children. They spent 3.5 hours more per week with their children than secular men. So that would be both discipline, like setting limits on screen time, as well as affection, spending time with them in church youth group and sports. Evangelical couples, you mentioned this, evangelical couples divorce at the lowest rate of any group in America, 35% lower than secular couples, which is significant. And the biggest surprise was that they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So let me give you a quote. Sometimes a quote will really crystallize it.
Oh, yeah.
So this is from Brad Wilcox. He's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. He's considered one of the best marriage researchers in the country, to the point where he gets quoted in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post, which is pretty unusual for a Christian. He is a conservative Catholic. But he wrote an article for the New York Times in which he said, it turns out that, the direct quote, it turns out that the happiest wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. And then he turns to his secular colleagues, because I don't know if you know this, but sociology is one of the most secular fields out there. And he says, I love this quote. This is actually my favorite. Academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular, because conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most active and expressive fathers and the most emotionally engaged husbands. And by the way, the men themselves also test out higher. I should say this, 73% versus 59% of secular men. The men themselves say that they are happier in their marriages as well. And so this is important because it's not a pep talk from some religious leader. Right?
Right.
This is solid empirical evidence. This is research-based findings that show that Christian men actually do test out as better husbands and fathers.
It's the quote that's just sticking in my mind, that's just ringing through everything you're saying right now is up front. I think you said it was a man who said that talking about healthy masculinity was like talking about healthy cancer. Like what a sad thing to hear and say, I guess, if you say it, and then hear the statistics afterwards saying, okay, so a man that stares at the world through a Christian worldview, is all of the sudden more motivated to be better to the people around him. And it's not just something that we say, it's quantitative, it's in the data. To hear you to prove it out that's just mind-blowing stuff. It falls in the face of a quote like that. I mean, I guess that maybe goes into my next question, which is sort of the two competing scripts for masculinity you talk about, because sort of the caricature in my mind of like a toxic masculinity is this like angry guy, abusive, loud, he's hypersexual, he's hyper aggressive, he's drinking all the time, he's a macho man. But that's not the picture I have of a masculine man who follows Christ. Could you talk a little bit about those sort of two competing scripts?
Yeah, I have to tell you, I put this at the front of the book, and I have to tell you this. You get some of the background. The reason
Yeah.
I put it at the front of the back of the book is that this has proved to be the most controversial book I've ever written, which did
Wow.
surprise me because my book Love Thy Body deals with abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism.
Right.
But this one was more controversial. And what I do, by the way, when I write a book, I always do a lot of reading groups. Graduate students and high school students and local apologetics groups like William Lane Craig has community groups. And the reason I do that is because it helps me to find out all the rough edges, you know. But in this case, what happened is that when people in my reading groups told friends and family that they were going through a book on a manuscript at that point, a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first response was, whose side is she on? Yeah, very defensive. Whose side is she on? And men
Ah,
tended to assume that if a woman was writing a book on masculinity, she was a male-bashing feminist.
of course.
And more progressive people tended to assume that since they knew I was a conservative Christian, I was probably, a red pill, person defending masculinity. And so I put this study at the beginning of the book, and it helped to sort of diffuse that initial hostility. So this was a study by a sociologist who's not himself a Christian, but he's well enough known that he gets invited to speak all around the world. And he came up with an ingenious experiment where he would ask young men themselves. He would ask them, what does it mean if I say be a good man? What does that mean? And he said all around the world, even cultures that have no Christian background, young men would immediately start saying integrity, duty, sacrifice, honesty, do the right thing, look out for the little guy. I sort of like that one. Be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And he would say, where'd you learn that? And they'd say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. To which we as Christians would say, they're made in God's image. And
That's right.
even men without a Christian background really understand that their unique masculine strengths were not given them to get whatever they want, but provide, protect for those that they love. But then the sociologist would follow up with a second question, and this was the key. He would say, well, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men themselves would say, no, that's completely different. A real man means be tough, never show weakness, win at all costs, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language there. And so this sociologist concluded that men actually are sort of caught between two conflicting scripts. On one hand, they do know inherently, universally, innately, they know what the good man is. I think that's very, very, very encouraging for us as Christians, that all men do know what a good man
Yes.
is. But they do also feel pressure to live up to a more cultural script of the real man, which is very different traits.
Hmm.
Not that they're all bad, like tough. We all want people to hang tough in a crisis. But if it gets disconnected from a moral vision of the good man, it can slide into dominance, control, misogyny, and so on. What we might call the Andrew Tate phenomenon today. And I have to tell
Right.
you that I have a graduate student who's now teaching high school. And she wrote me an email and said, all my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in their yearbook. I said, where do you teach? She said, at a classical Christian school.
Wow.
So that's my response. I thought, that's not a good sign that even Christian young men are sort of being drawn to these online influences. And that just underscores how important it is for us to be giving young men a positive, aspirational, healthy view of biblical masculinity.
Yeah, they're getting bits and pieces of, like you mentioned, through this, through their Imago Dei, they're able to sort of sense, the core traits of masculinity, and yet they manifest in these bizarre, weird ways. Like, being strong is a positive thing, sacrificial, protecting. These are like good traits, and then taken to their, I guess, secular, falling off the other side of the ship, they become these sort of like bizarre manifestations of kind of algorithm Instagram influencer culture, like you're talking about, and yet there is a biblical core there that is beautiful and is redemptive. And so I love you pointing that out. It's fantastic.
Yeah, so of course, one of the questions people ask me is, well, what do you think are the differences between men and women? I had to
Hmm.
put that in the first chapter too, again, because there was so much controversy over this book. So in my first chapter, I say, well, let's just start with biology. The bare, basic empirical facts is that
Right.
men are bigger, stronger. They have 75% more upper body muscle mass and 90% more upper body strength. Because of testosterone, they do tend to be more aggressive and more risk-taking. And this is just the creational givens. We have
Yes.
to bring ourselves to the point where, as Christians, we can say the creational givens are good. This is the
Hmm.
way God created men, and this is good. And so, standing against our culture, we need to find a way to say, as Christians, these are good. Now, we have to also realize the cultural context we're in. The reason feminists have been opposed to even recognizing differences between men and women. By the way, there are even women. My own students have sometimes said this. Transgender women who are really biological males who want to compete, in women's sports. I have literally had my own students say, well, women could be as strong as men if they would just work out. Well, no, that's not true. And so but what we do have to do is recognize women's strengths as strengths. As soon as we say there's differences, it's just human to say some are better, some are worse.
Yes.
And historically, in most cultures, it's been men are better because they're physically stronger and so on. And so it's very important as Christians that we counter that by saying, no, women's strengths are actually strengths, right?
Yes.
Women's super strength is that they have children. And young children are extremely demanding, 24 hours a day. If they're distressed, you don't argue with them, you don't punish them, you don't reason with them, you meet their distress. And so
Yes.
it requires certain character traits of being able to drop whatever you're doing and meet someone else's need. And of course, young children is so vulnerable that you have to also be sensitive to dangers in their environment. So women become mama bears. They become
Yeah.
much more sensitive to environmental threats. And so we have to acknowledge all of these as strengths so that we can counter the feminist idea that as soon as you acknowledge a difference, you're going to say men are better. No, we can acknowledge the difference and still see both male strengths and female strengths as strengths and affirm them as, like I said, creational givens.
That's really good. The cultural tide has swung a bit, obviously. For years, women have been in this position you're talking about, where women are seen as weaker than, but now it feels like this cultural tide has sort of swung. You have things like Title IX that were instituted to assist equality for men and women happening. I'm reading now, seeing that discrepancy in college graduates, just in the study for this podcast, seeing that absolutely flip the other way around, and yet there's no new title instituted for that. But I do see a lot, and I want to quote some of these statistics to you because I'm curious to know what you think. I'm reading here, men, you just absolutely suffering in many different ways. Most victims of violent crime are men. Men are 12 times likely to be in prison, 4 times more likely to commit suicide, 3 times more likely to overdose. Boys in school are twice as likely to be suspended at school for the same infraction as a girl, and the homeless population is overwhelmingly male. Seeing that happen, men are suffering it to some degree, and it is happening, falling behind in education, employment, health, all these different things. Why are people beginning to sort of ignore the real problems that men face today, in your opinion?
Yeah, first of all, nobody expected it. When Title IX was passed, to create girl-friendly curriculum and workshops and programs to help girls, at that point, girls were behind boys in education. And people thought, well, we'll bring girls up to boys. Nobody realized what would happen is that girls would shoot right by boys. And so in education now, girls are way outpacing boys, both in test and both in standardized tests and in grades, and also in higher education. So that's all the way from. It starts in kindergarten because girls have more fine motor control, and so boys can't handle scissors as well or a crayon. And so already in kindergarten, boys feel like they're falling behind, which is tragic. All the way through elementary school, high school, and then in college. I didn't know this until I wrote my book, by the way. In college now, the average is 60% female students, 40% male.
Wow.
And in small private colleges, like when I started at HCU, Houston Christian University, which was 12 years ago, we were 70-30. 70% female, 30% male. And by the way, do you know how we've decided to try to counter that? We started a football team.
That'll help.
I know you'll appreciate that as
I
a
would.
former NFL player. We started as soon as we announced it, we started getting more male students. Amazing. And then we started an engineering school for STEM subjects. So we are almost now at the 60-40. We have improved. But there has been some writers have been writing about the fact that places like Harvard are quietly instituting affirmative action for male students because they don't want to go beyond 60-40. Because if they do, pretty soon the female students won't come either. If there's no male students around, the female students won't come either. And so really, Ivy League schools have been instituting affirmative action to get more males. What that means is males can score lower on the standardized tests and still get in. That's what that means. But then as adults, like you said, I mean, you covered it well, so I don't really need to belabor the point. But yes, men are more likely to end up in prison. I used to work for Prison Fellowship, which is the national prison ministry. So of course we knew that some 90% or more of prison inmates are male, especially, of course, violent offenders. And men are more likely to be homeless. Men are more likely to be drug and alcohol addicted. Men are more likely to commit suicide, all the things that you mentioned. And then actually the one that was the most surprising is that men's employment level has gone down. It's not showing up in the normal statistics because they're not looking for work anymore. And so researchers had to dig deeper. And what they tell us is that male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels.
Wow.
And that was a bit of a shock when I read that, because we all remember what a crisis the Great Depression was.
Wow.
Male unemployment is at Great Depression era levels. And so there was an article by a magazine called The New Scientist, which said, well, this was referring even to the fact that men commit suicide at greater levels. It said the greatest factor now, the demographic factor, that's how they put it, the greatest demographic factor now for early death is being male. So I suggest in my book, it's time for us to have some compassion on men, that, you know, men are social beings just like the rest of us. They are affected by the surrounding society. And so the negative definitions of masculinity are having negative impacts on men. And it's time for us to start reversing course and having compassion on men who are demonstrably doing worse, both as children and as adults.
So when somebody says, you know, like talking about healthy masculinity is like talking about healthy cancer, and then you talk about how testosterone is sort of the driver for all these physical differences, certainly, but even that play themselves out personality-wise or whatever, it kind of feels like, as I was reading the statistics in your book and I'm hearing you talk, I was like, okay, well, what do I do then with the testosterone in my body? Because like, it's just there. Like, I don't know, like, can I pull it out? You know what I'm saying? Like, it sounds like I'm kind of doomed to fail from the beginning because of just the way I'm made.
I have 2 chapters on the sociological data on Christian men. And the second chapter, so it's chapter 2 and 3 in the book, but chapter 3 just goes through studies done with surveys of Christian men. And to tell you the truth, I was blown away. I was blown away with how loving and kind and generous Christian men are. You know, these are actual surveys. Some people have said, well, why didn't you deal with, you know, this sort of in-house debates over even, remember, the key words are complementarian and egalitarian.
Mm-hmm.
And I say in the book, I'm not dealing with that because I'm dealing with the sociological data. And they didn't divide it down that way. In fact, I'll tell you, 2 of my top researchers said it doesn't seem to make much difference. So Brad Wilcox, who I have already mentioned, he's the top marriage researcher in the country. And he said, in our research, you know, women of theologically conservative Christian men test out as the happiest. And they did actually do one study of egalitarian women, couples. And he said they weren't any happier. I mean, I'm sorry, but in our studies, the egalitarian couples were not any happier. And they say it's partly because egalitarian couples tend to have sort of a scorekeeping mentality. You know, I did this much. Did you do this much? Are you doing the same are you doing what I'm doing? You know, are you keeping score? And so, and the second expert I quoted was not even a Christian. His name is John Gottman, and he's considered the top marriage psychologist in the nation. And he too said, in our practice, we get some men who think, you know, some couples who think the man should be in charge, you know, so they're complementarian. And we get some couples who are more egalitarian. And here's how he put it. The emotionally intelligent husbands know what the most important thing is, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wife. So I say from the beginning in the book, I'm not going to deal with these in-house debates between complementarian, egalitarian, because the experts say that's not really what matters. What matters is what I go through in the next chapter, which is actual surveys of men, evangelical couples, where, like I said, to my own surprise, they deal with headship in a way that's very loving, very mutual, very respectful. And I should add this. In the beginning of my book, I do personalize this in my introduction. To show that in a way to show that I've been there. So in my introduction, I talk about that I grew up in a very physically abusive home. My father was very physically abusive. Sometimes books on abuse will ask, was it open hand or closed fist? It was closed fist. His favorite was the knuckle fist, with the middle finger extended to make a sharper stab of pain. So I came to this, as you can imagine, as I grew up, I ricocheted into extreme feminism. I read all the major feminist books: Betty Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, Kate Millett, Susan Brown Miller, all the major feminist books. And I thought they were great. I thought they were wonderful. And then I became a Christian, and I had to start rethinking this whole issue. And so even in writing this book, I was still surprised when I read the surveys of Christian men and read how loving, how respectful they were to their wives. So all that to say, testosterone is a good thing because it does lead men to be loving, respectful, but also taking the role of provide and protect. That is sort of the standard, universal, innate. Let me give you one more study. So this was a study done by an anthropologist, first ever study ever done across the globe of concepts of masculinity. There's been histories of men, but this was concepts of what it means to be a man. And he's not a Christian. But his conclusion was that all around the globe, men have an innate, universal sense of what it means to be the good man. Somewhat like the study I said earlier, which was by a sociologist. This was an anthropologist, and he said, all around the globe, men understand that their masculinity consists of what he called the three Ps, provide, protect, and procreate. The last one meaning become a father, or if you're not literally a father, build into the next generation, become a mentor for the next generation. And so I thought this is very encouraging because most men do not respond very well to being called toxic, right? Nobody would. But based on these studies, we can be assured that when we approach men, they do have an innate, universal, inherent sense that their masculinity is a good thing, and that's given them to the three Ps: provide, protect, and procreate.
That's really good, Nancy. I've heard it said, that empathy is not a zero-sum game, that we can care about women and also care equally about men. We don't have to pull empathy away from women in order to be empathetic towards men. And I think you made a really strong case for that. And men being just who they are do a lot. And that's the Imago Dei. And that's really what we were created to be. And speaking of which, I would like to pivot a little bit to Love Thy Body, because really, that concept is so prevalent in that book. There's sort of this thing that's happened. I think you touched on it with the sexuality conversation, and you lay it out beautifully. And I've quoted from you I've lost count how many times I've quoted from you as I've preached. But being able to sort of pull the personhood away from the physical nature of the body and making these sort of two distinct things, that's happened. So I guess what is the person-body divide in your words, and how are we seeing it play itself out in society? I know you've mentioned a few, but I'd love to hear you expand on that.
Yeah, so as I said, I am an apologist, and so my main goal is to help Christians understand what secular people think, because after all, we're called to be missionaries, and missionaries have to learn the language of the people they're talking to.
Yes.
It's not their job to learn our language. It's our job to learn theirs. And one of the most important things we need to understand is that secular thinkers do draw this distinction between body and person. And I'll give you the most obvious example is abortion, because secular bioethicists today all agree that that life begins at conception. The evidence from DNA and from genetics is too strong to deny it. So they acknowledge that the fetus is human from the moment of conception. So how do they get around that then if they want to support abortion? What they do is they draw this distinction that you mentioned between the body and the person. Well, the body, the fetus as a biological organism is human, genetically, physiologically, chromosomally, anatomically, the fetus is human. But they'll argue it's not yet a person. And personhood is this abstract concept of usually tied to some kinds of mental abilities like self-awareness, self-determination, ability to make choices, even the ability to see your future, ability to have an explicit desire to live. These are some of the things that secular bioethicists have listed as personhood. So what they're really saying is that there's two sort of separate dimensions, that we're a body on the one hand, but then we're a person, which is a sort of philosophical concept that's very vague and very subjective and very arbitrary. Because if you separate personhood from biology, then it becomes, well, whatever the bioethicist wants it to be. It's
Right.
Every secular bioethicist draws the line at a different place. And so this body-person dualism, in Love Thy Body, I show that how that is what drives the secular ethic, not only in abortion, but euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, and even transhumanism. So it's important for us to understand this dichotomy.
So transhumanism, you mean someone changing from a human in their mind to like an animal? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, most transhumanists, well, you're thinking of furries. Furries are people who say, I'm really an animal.
Right,
Oh,
right.
right. So I have one student who used to be a furry.
Oh, wow.
Transhumanists are more people who are looking toward the future and saying that we can now construct the next stage of evolution. That evolution is, of course, always advancing higher and higher. And so through genetic engineering and AI and so on, we can construct the next level of engineering. And the reason I say that, too, has a body-person dualism, because I have several quotes from these guys, from transhumanists who say things like this. This is Ray Kurzweil, who is the director of engineering at Google. So these are not fringe people. These are very influential people.
Yes.
Ray Kurzweil said, humanity is a biological concept. What we're doing is transcending biology. So again, it's the idea that, yes, in terms of biology, we're human. But who cares? What we want is the next stage. Or a person who's had incredible influence on the transgender movement. I mean, the transhumanist movement is himself transgender. It's a guy who invented Sirius XM radio. So he's a multi-billionaire, and he now identifies as a female. After having 2 kids, he now identifies as a female. And he literally argues transgenderism is the stepping stone to transhumanism, because if you're willing to allow that your body can be changed, your body's not really who you are. It's not really essential to your identity. Your body can be changed to fit your mental sense of identity. Well, that's the step to transhumanism, where we can transcend the body altogether, and maybe even, download our mind onto a computer disk. And he literally says the idea that the flesh and blood body has any value or dignity this is his term, it's the sin of fleshism. The sin of fleshism. In other words, it's like racism, which is the sin of preferring your own race, or sexism, which is the sin of preferring your own sex. So for him, to prefer a biological, physical body is the sin of fleshism. And so this is where transhumanism is leading now, is where even to think it's important to have a physical flesh and blood body is a sin. It's wrong. That's where we're heading on the next stage.
Wow, and it does feel like that's like the logical conclusion if you know, of transgenderism. Certainly, if I'm a man and I could be a woman or vice versa, then why couldn't I be anything else? Or trans race is, I don't know if trans racism is a term, but thinking if I'm black, if I want to be Latino, and is that okay? Or, but what I am seeing play out and I sort of, this is what I wanted to ask you about, because you're kind of seeing in some sense the rubber meets the road, whether or not, like, if I believe I'm a bird and I can't fly, then, what sort of bird am I? If I believe I'm, I guess, a flying bird and I can't fly, am I really one? We are seeing that sort of happen in regards to women's sports. That's what I wanted to talk about, because we are seeing biological males enter into the women's sports arena, with the swimmer, the NCAA championship. It's happening across college NCAA volleyball right now. My wife being a former college volleyball player, I'm sort of familiar with that. And we're seeing that, okay, men's enter into women's sports. They compete at a very different level, especially if they haven't been on some sort of hormone suppressing drugs. They are hitting the ball harder, they're jumping higher, and they're winning. And there has been some cultural pushback to that, to say, well, hold on a second. I think this is where I stop and draw the line, even if I have been in support of transgenderism. Have you seen that play itself out at all? What's your just overall thoughts and opinions on how you've seen this sort of men enter into women's sports play itself out?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because it is changing rapidly right now. The Trump administration has issued some executive orders against male-bodied people in women's sports.
Right.
There's been obviously people who support that are fighting back, so that's what's happening right now. But I just today read a New York Times survey, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's 80 to 85% of Americans, including many Democrats, are against the idea of male-bodied people in women's sports. This is probably the cutting edge that's really changed public opinion. Up until now, it was, these poor young people with gender dysphoria, we should accommodate them. But when they start entering women's sports, fathers get angry. and so, yeah, I do think that right now, I mean, we're at the cutting edge right now, where the Trump administration has issued 3 executive orders having to do with transgenderism. And I'm sorry, I interrupted my own self. And the New York Times had 2 surveys. Some 80 to 85% of people in America are against male-bodied men competing in women's sports. And the second one was an equally large number, almost 80%, are against transgender surgeries and cross-gender hormones for minors. And so there is a tremendous amount of popular support now. It has not been expressed just because we have so much censorship. We have so much censorship of our media these days, until Elon Musk bought X, or Twitter, that most people didn't realize that the overwhelming public opinion was that it's unfair for male-bodied people to compete in women's sports. And so it's very recent that we've begun to realize, actually, the American public feels strongly about this issue, because so many of them have daughters who are being, what was it? I think there was like 600 medals that have gone to men that would have gone to women in a whole range of different sports. And this doesn't mean that you have to be, heartless towards young people who have gender dysphoria. In my book, Love Thy Body, I do tell a sort of an extended anecdote of a young boy who did have gender dysphoria, and how his parents dealt with that, how he ended up not transitioning. So I give a lot of space in my book to the reality of gender dysphoria and how painful it is. It truly is a painful condition to feel like, well, this was a boy, so I don't feel like I'm a boy. But of course, the girls don't really accept me either, because I'm a boy. So I don't fit in anywhere. And the anecdote I tell is a young boy who ended up saying to his parents, I don't fit in anywhere. I think the way girls do. I like the things girls like. God should have made me a girl. And so I do deal very openly with the fact that gender dysphoria is real and it's difficult. But what we're seeing today is a lot of men who are not necessarily gender dysphoric, who are demanding the right to women's spaces. And, well, if you really want to get technical about it, there are two forms of gender dysphoria. The classic version, like when we used to call it transsexualism, was almost always male, and it was almost always quite young. But now we're seeing people who are much older, like Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner, who did not, quote unquote, discover that he was really gender dysphoric until he was, had been married, had several children, was in a very masculine profession, namely sports. Right. And that is, a lot of psychologists say that's actually a very different form of gender dysphoria. We really have to have a different name for it. And those are the type, that second type, are the type that tends to demand entrance into women's sports and, to demand entrance into women's prisons and to demand entrance into into rape centers and so on. It's a very different mentality. So while we can have compassion for people who have genuine gender dysphoria, I think politically, the trend is turning now with the new administration that men who quote unquote, discover that they're really women later in life are often very masculine in their aggressiveness in claiming the right to enter women's spaces. And so the political climate is changing on that second category.
I want to ask you one more question that's related to this before you go. You in your book, you talk about Gnosticism and how that's played in to sort of this sort of divide between the body and the person. And I had Dr. Greg Allison on, who wrote Embodied, another book, very similar concept in some sense, but very different book, great book. And he shared the same sentiment around Gnosticism and its impact on how we understand the human body. I want to ask you, because the moment I read Love Thy Body when it came out, I thought, oh man, I feel like this relates to how we look at what we eat and what our food is like, and how it's possible that we can eat whatever we want, but at the same time sort of like hold our personhood aside. I'll give you an example. I might say like, oh, it doesn't matter what I eat so much as like, I love Jesus. It's okay. It doesn't really matter. I just want to know from you, from the person who wrote this book, what do you think of that concept? Do you think it's possible that the way people approach their eating and drinking habits could potentially be affected by Gnosticism and this like person-body divide, or not?
Well, I did go on your website when you invited me to be on this podcast, and I really resonate with all of your advice on fitness and diet and eating better. I'm really into that topic, and so I'm very sympathetic. Yes, in my book, Love Thy Body, I do say that what we're facing today in the secular world with this denigration of the body, whether it's an abortion, whether we didn't go through all the examples, but like transgenderism, obviously, is a denigration of the body, because transgender activists argue explicitly that your gender identity has nothing to do with your body.
Right.
I'll quote, the academic world is what filters down and affects ordinary people. So I'll quote one academic book. This was from a Princeton University professor. And she said, literally, word for word, she said, what the real body, meaning the physical body, what the physical body tells us is nothing. It has no meaning at all. And so this is what's being taught down to kindergarten today. Your body has no meaning at all. It's not part of your authentic self. Or the Washington Post actually quoted a curriculum for first graders that said, you may be a boy, even if you have what some people call girl parts.
Wow.
And you may be a girl, even if you have what some people call, boy parts. So it was really saying all the way down to kindergarten and first grade, your body does not give you any clues to your identity. It's not part of your authentic self. So what I do in the book is I say, hey, basically we're facing the same thing that the early church faced with Gnosticism, because Gnosticism was also, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Augustine was a Manichae. All of these isms in the first century were saying that the physical world, the material world, is the realm of death, decay, and destruction. And so the goal of salvation is to escape from the physical world. In fact, they said the body is the prison of the soul. That was one of their favorite phrases. And salvation is escaping from that prison. In that historical context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary, because it said the physical world is good, right? Because it's the creation of a good God. By the way, Gnosticism even had several layers of deities. And it said that it was the lowest God, therefore an evil God, who had created this universe.
Wow.
That was their way of explaining why this universe was so bad, because it was created by an evil God. And so Christians said, no. This world was created by the supreme deity, who is a good God, and it is therefore intrinsically good. And yes, there's been a fall, but the fall is a bit like taking a great artistic masterpiece, a great artistic masterpiece, and a child takes a magic marker and scribbles on it. Yes, it's defaced, but the original beauty of the Mona Lisa, still shines through. And that's what we need to communicate, that the Christian view is that the original beauty of God's good creation still shines through. And then what about the incarnation? Actually, that was the greatest scandal in the first century.
Wow.
Because it said that highest deity had actually entered into the material realm and taken on a physical body.
Right. So
the incarnation was the ultimate affirmation of the dignity of the human body. And then when Jesus did, quote unquote, escape the physical realm, as in other words, when he died on a crucifixion, he did escape the realm that Gnosticism said we should do. We should aspire to escape. But what did he do then? He came back in a physical body. And really, at that time, critics of Christianity literally argued, who would want to come back to the realm of the body? This is not spiritual progress. This is regress.
Right.
And then, of course, at the end of time, what does God say he's going to do? Even many Christians think our ultimate goal is to be sort of, filmy, non-material ghost floating around in heaven. But that's not what the Bible says. It says God is going to create a new heavens and a new earth, and the resurrection of the body. From the very beginning, the Apostles' Creed has affirmed the resurrection of the body. I was talking to a non-Christian who had grown up in the Christian church, and she said, actually, you're right. That is amazing that the Christian church affirmed the resurrection of the body right from the beginning. So this is an incredibly high view of the physical realm. I can guarantee you there's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy.
Come on.
And and as Christians, we should be communicating that with incredible joy and enthusiasm. A lot of times we don't know what the secular world teaches. Actually, when we know it, we're even more enthusiastic about the Christian message, so that we can convey it with that kind of joy. And, the good news is not only salvation. The good news is creation. That God created us, body and soul, and body, and that he does call us to love our body, as I say in the title of my book.
Right. And you know what? I think that's a much more compelling message than sometimes the way we state the gospel, the good news of Jesus, the gospel. And when you get to understand this big, beautiful concept of God renewing and restoring the world, I think that just feels so much more hope-giving to people. Nancy, you've been awesome. I want to promote both these books to all our listeners. The Toxic War on Masculinity, go get this one, and Love Thy Body, my personal favorite. Nancy, where can people hear more from you, learn more about you, and get your books? Yeah,
thanks for asking. So I do have a website. My publisher, very generously redesigned it so it's colorful and fun. But nancypearcey.com. Nancy
Awesome.
Pearcey, PEARCEY.com. It's the best place, and there's a place for you to leave comments, and people do that. I do enjoy hearing from people. That's the best place to sort of connect. I'm very active on Twitter. If you're on Twitter, you can also come over and see me on Twitter as well.
I'll put the links for your Twitter handle and your website in the show notes. Nancy, thank you so much for being on. This was wonderful.
Thank you so much. I knew when I looked at your website that we would have a kindred spirit. So I've enjoyed it.
Awesome. One more thing. The statements in this video or audio have not been evaluated by the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Information provided here is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. The information provided by this website and or by this podcast is not a substitute for a physician visit and should not be taken as medical advice of any sort or kind. This is a list of resources for further self-research and work with your personal physician if needed. By using any of this information, by watching, listening, or reading it, you are accepting responsibility for your own health and health decisions and expressly release this podcast, its participants, and its websites from any and all liability whatsoever, including that which might come from negligence. Also, don't smoke cigarettes, don't do drugs, stay in school, don't touch hot surfaces, and please wear your safety glasses when cutting wood.